Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be starting the next major project on the True Spirit, rebuilding the 8 3/4. I've got a 741 third member here, just spare laying around I've had for well over a decade. Now I know some people will be like, oh, it's a 741, it's not strong enough. Whatever, it's going behind a stock 5.9, and the reality is a 741 is stronger than probably a Ford 9-inch, so it's going to be more than adequate for what I'm doing. One of the things that I've got going on here is, it's kind of hard to see here, but right there, one of the side teeth, or one of the teeth on the side gear anyway, completely missing, which is why this thing's been sitting on the floor for decades and getting kicked around. So decided what I'll do is I'll rebuild this instead of having to take the one that's in the truck out. Changing gear ratio anyway, so everything has to come out. These side gears, the price for those, along with new spider gears and everything else, turns out is not greatly different than a limited slip. So if I've got to take all this out, might as well go limited slip when I put it back together. Picked up a whole bunch of stuff from Dr. Diff. A whole new limited slip center section. New ring and pinion to match the ring and pinion that I'm putting in the front. New bearing, seals, everything. So basically, we're just going to go through this entire thing and replace everything. Before we start taking apart this third member, it's important to note that these caps must stay in the same side and in the same orientation. Orientation's pretty easy because, you know, they're not symmetric. They've got this bevel here and not here, so you're not going to flip it this way. But this one needs to match here. This one needs to match here. Unlike the Daytona 44, which already had markings, this one is not marked. So what I'm going to do is just use a punch and mark the cap and the case. So I'll just put 1 dot here and here, and then 2 here and here. That way when I put it back together, I know which piece goes where. I'm just going to use this punch. So I've got 1 dot there, and then over here, we'll put 2. So it looks like this. Instead of paint, which would come off with solvent or anything like this, these indentations aren't going anywhere. And then over on the other side, I just put 1 and 1. Now we can take this thing apart. All right, the only thing left is this race. And this race. Drive the front race, which is, I guess, just out of view here, with a 54 millimeter. So that drives that out. And we'll flip it over and drive this rear one out. And that came out with a 57 millimeter. Since I'm going back together with a different ring and pinion, and in fact a sure grip, so I don't need this carrier, most of this isn't going to go back into this housing. I'm going to clean up the caps and the adjusters, get all of that stuff together, then clean up the inside of this housing. Then we'll start reassembly. A couple of things to notice here. First, take a look at the spline on these inputs. This is the one that I just took out, and this is the one that I ordered. So they're obviously different. That means that the yoke I pulled off of this, I can't use over here, and you have to use the yoke to tighten this down in order to set bearing preload. So for right now, I'm actually stuck. I can't proceed. Another thing worth noting, if you've pulled one of these apart or if you've looked at videos, oftentimes I'll talk about a crush sleeve. A crush sleeve is a piece that goes in here that when you tighten it down, it, like its name suggests, crushes, and that helps set that bearing preload. The 489 case 8 3/4 uses one, but this is a 741. It doesn't use one of those. Instead, it actually has this, which is just like the crush sleeve eliminators that they sell from Dr. Diff. So basically this will go down, sits right on top of the bearing, and then you've got shims. There are some that came with the kit, but here's the two that were in there before, and these are used to adjust that bearing preload. So, before I can go any further though, I need to either get a different pinion with the correct spline, or I need to get a different yoke that matches this spline. When you order a pinion, you've got two options for splines, 10 spline or 29. I ordered the 29 because you can't really tell what the spline is until you pull the yoke off, and I had not done that on this one. So I ended up ordering one with 29, but the yoke was a 10, so it obviously isn't going to fit. Fortunately, the rear end that was in the truck did have a 29, though it needed to be repaired here. I'll put a video up here for that on how you repair that. But this gives me the 29 spline, which fits on here, and this will be required in order to tighten everything down in order to set this bearing preload. So let's get the case cleaned up and then get this installed and set that preload. Alright, I've got the case all cleaned up. Before I put the races in, I'm going to put this bearing, well, not this bearing, a new bearing, onto the new pinion. So let's go over to the press and put that on. We want the bearing taper to be facing this direction on the pinion. So really the easiest way to do this is take the race, put the bearing into it, put it on here, so we're facing down. Take the pinion, put it in there, get your press plates nice and close. I'm going to lubricate that shaft and bearing with a little WD-40. Then we just push it down. There we go. Make sure it spins nice and freely. And that's ready to go. Alright, next we'll take this race and we're going to drive it in right here. Once again, just using a seal driver. Make sure it's all the way seated. The sound will change when you hit the hammer on it. I'll flip it over and do the other side. Alright, both those races are in. Next we're going to put the pinion in and set the preload. Now, it's worth mentioning, this is a 741 case. There are 3 different cases for 8 3/4. One of them takes a crush sleeve, the other 2 do not. 741 does not. This is the old pinion. It's got this spacer on here. On, I think it's the 489 case. This is a crush sleeve. This crush sleeve, well, this isn't a crush sleeve, but on the one that does take one, the amount that you crush that sleeve is what sets the bearing preload. So you basically have to bolt it together and tighten down the nut to cause this thing to crush to the right distance so that you have bearing preload. On this one, we just have this spacer, and you can see right here, these washers, they're basically some shims. These are what set the preload. So we put this on, and then we're going to put some spacer shims on, and I guess I'll start with what it was in there to begin with. Have no idea if it's going to even be close. So, generally speaking, if you're using a crush sleeve, it just goes together once. As long as you don't screw up the sleeve, you're good to go. With one of these, it's not unusual to have to put it together and take it apart several times to get it to the right preload. So we take our new one, put the spacer on there, and then again, I really have no idea what spacing I'm going to need here. So I'm just going to start with the shims that were on there to begin with. Make sure they don't have any debris or anything on them. The rebuild kit with all the bearings came with a whole stack of these. Another small note, the ends of these on the 10 spline and the 29 are different size. So the kit actually came with a nut and washer for each size. Before we put this in, this bearing needs to be on there, and then we have to put the yoke and the nut on, but in order for that to be correct, we've got to get the seal in first. So before we work on that, let's get that seal in. It's probably a little bit of overkill, but I like to put RTV around the seal before I drive it in. And now, we'll take the pinion, put it through, put the yoke on, and put the nut on the back and tighten it down. We'll see how close we are for a preload. That bearing is a real tight fit on this, and it's not wanting to go in super easy. It does press against this part of the yoke. So I'm going to put that on there, flip it over, take it over and put it into the press and give it a little push. Shouldn't take a lot of force, but it's more than just a slip fit. All right, now I put the washer and nut on here, and I'm going to tighten this down, torque it down. And once we have it torqued down, then we can check the bearing preload on this. The reality is the book says 210 foot-pounds, so I'm going to use the air impact to drive that on. All right, now we'll check the preload. You need a torque wrench that does inch-pounds. The preload on this one for new bearings, it says 20 to 35 inch-pounds. And it's hard to see, but it's only at about 10 right now. So that means I actually need to take out some shims. So now we just have to disassemble everything, get the pinion out, and those shims that were in there, I'm going to take one of the two out, put it back together, and check everything again. Well, I didn't feel like carrying the camera around to the press and everything and doing it all, but I took a shim out, and now it's too tight. So, back apart, put some shim back in. So this is the shim I took out. It is 25 thousandths thick. I'm going to go back in with this one, which is about 15. Still too tight. When you're checking this preload, you want to check it while you're moving. So you're going to have, it hops up when you first start moving it, and then it'll come into a settled state. This one, it's really hard to see because of where I need to hold it in the camera. Oh. But if we run it past there, let's try this again. Hard to see, but we're at about 20 foot-pounds, which is where I want it. I ended up taking this thing apart and putting it back together 5, maybe 6 times. And to give you an idea of the tolerance, right now it's got 44 thousandths of thickness of shim in there. 49 was way too loose, and 38 was way too tight. So really there's a range of, I would guess 8, maybe 10 thousandths at the most of an area where it needs to be in order to hit the spec that you want. At any rate, we've got this in, we've got the preload set. We can now put in the bearings and the ring and the sure grip. So let's get on to that. As I mentioned before, I got a new clutch type sure grip from Dr. Diff, so I don't have to do any of the rebuild of this. Next step is going to be putting the ring gear onto this. Now, important piece to know, whether it's sure grip or open, this ring gear, it takes bolts that are left-hand thread, not right-hand. So if you're trying to take them off and you're having difficulty, make sure you're going righty-loosey, lefty-tighty. This ring gear also doesn't just drop on here. It's an interference fit. So you can't just set it down and turn it to align the holes. You need to make sure that these holes here, well, I guess these holes here, align with the threaded holes here when you set it together. Otherwise, you can't get the bolts in. I'm going to flip this over into this and then pull this up, and we'll use the bolts to actually pull it together. Now I'm just going to use the Ugga Dugga to pull it tight. Alright, now the ring gear is pulled up onto the carrier. I can put all of these bolts in, and I'm going to Loctite them in when I do it. Alright, we've got them all run down in. Now I just need to torque them all to 55 foot-pounds. Next, we'll take it over to the press and put the bearings on. Again, the cone taper goes this direction so that the races go on outside. Nicely, there's no shim that goes in here like we did on the Dana 44. The adjustment on this will be done on this side. Give it a little WD-40. Bearing. And race. I'm just going to use one of these press plates as a flat surface. So that gets it started square. I still need to go further down. So I need to find a socket or a cup big enough to go over this. So when you're pressing on this bearing, you want to press on either this inner sleeve or the outer race, but not on the cage. If you press on the cage, you're going to ruin the bearing. So I'm going to use this press tool that is opened up enough to allow the shaft to come through. And this back side is actually going to push against both this inner race and the outer race. And then again, we've got to put a plate or something in that we can push against. make sure it's fully seated right here. And you can see the inner shaft here extends past the bearing. That's why we needed that cup. Now, we'll just flip it over and do the other side. I've just fixed the case into a vise here by the yoke. It allows me to move this without the pinion turning. Next, we're going to put the cap and adjuster in. Remember, the caps have to go in the correct side. So this one has 2 dots. This one has 2 dots that I made. Take the adjuster and just drop it in here. Try to get it into the threads and square to the bearing. And then we put the cap on. And we'll just go hand tight for now. Once we get both sides together, in order to set this up, we have to tighten or loosen these adjusters. Now, I'm sure there's some factory tool that's a spanner that goes into these 2 holes, but again, I don't have one. Nicely, it's pretty easy to make something. Basically, a 1/4 bolt fits right in there, and I have a chunk of reasonably thick square tube. So I'm going to weld a couple of these on here and here. And we'll just weld them right on here like this. So the general idea is this. We're going to tighten both of these down at an equal rate, and that's going to squeeze in and put preload on these bearings. We want to squeeze that in until it gets to about 6 or 8 thousandths or so. Once we get to that, we're going to tighten down a cap on each side. Now, it's important that they're all the way down here, and they're fairly easy to turn. I came in just against the race on each one, so we don't want them lifting up. But once we get it to about 6 thousandths of backlash, measured up here with the dial indicator, we'll then tighten down 1 bolt on each cap. Then we're going to tighten this one away from the ring down until we have about 0 backlash. It's like 1/2 thousandth, I think is what the spec is, but basically till we have just about 0 backlash. What that does when we tighten this is it pushes the ring against the pinion, which is over here. Once we have that in, we're going to put the lock on here and lock this in place. Then we're going to come back over here and tighten this one down, and that's going to push the ring back this direction as it adds preload to the bearings. Once we're back open to about 6 to 8 thousandths, we will then tighten down the other bolt on both of these caps and put the lock on this side, and we should be set at least for backlash. Doesn't mean we'll have the right wear pattern, but we'll at least have the backlash where we want it. Get the caps on, get the gaps down to nothing, run these up against the races, then turn them equal amounts, kind of like, 1 hole at a time, this side then this side, until you get down to about 6 thousandths. With the adjusters just tightened right up against the races, let's see, we've got about about 10 thousandths. So now we're going to tighten both of them up to shrink that down to about 6. I moved each one basically 1 hole, and it's now down to about 9. Well, we're now down to about It's like 6 thousandths or so. So now we torque down one cap on each side. Tightening those down will have changed the backlash. It's kind of hard to see, but we're now at about 8 thousandths. So now we tighten this one down, which is going to push the ring against the pinion till we have close to 0 backlash. So you can see we have less than half a thou now. And we tighten this one down to open that gap back up. Tightening this, I've opened up the gap to about 2 thousandths. I need to go to about 6 to 8. Sorry about all the jump shots, but this camera is really in the way. Got it to about 8 thousandths of backlash, so now I will torque the bolts that I hadn't torqued and put the lock on this one, and we can check the pattern. Now we'll take this marking compound and an acid brush and color, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 teeth. You want to get a nice, thick, fairly uniform coating on this. And then I'm just going to rotate the entire third member to drive that down into the pinion. Then I'm just going to move it back and forth here. You can see we're locked into the vise, so that's turning the ring gear. This looks really good. Let's get a little closer. So the area that got rubbed off, you can kind of see, it's fairly centered, this direction, but it also is nicely centered this way. So there's about the same amount here as there is deep down in. It's a little harder to see here, but they look really even. So this pinion is centered actually this direction and in and out. So the pinion depth is right, and it looks like the side to side is right as well. All right, so we've got this 8 3/4 center section completely rebuilt. It's got a sure grip, new ring and pinion, new bearings, new everything really. So it's ready to go into the housing. The housing I will probably disassemble and take over to powder coat, but then it can go into the truck. That's all there is for today. Thanks for watching.